What's a rabbit hole that completely pulled you in? Story 1. One rabbit hole that completely fried my brain was learning that the Federal Reserve is not actually federal in the way most people assume, and for a long time didn't really operate on physical reserves the way people imagine either. At first I thought it was just another boring government institution. Then I started reading about how it was created in 1913 after secretive meetings between bankers and politicians on Jekyll Island. The goal was to build a central banking system that could stabilize the economy while remaining somewhat independent from direct political control. That's where the rabbit hole started. The Federal Reserve is technically a system of regional reserve banks with a strange hybrid structure. The Board of Governors is federal, but the regional banks are connected to private member banks. So, despite the name, it's not purely government-owned in the simple way most people think. Then I started looking into how money itself is created. Most modern money isn't physical cash sitting in vaults. Commercial banks create money electronically through lending, while the Fed influences the system through interest rates, bond purchases, and monetary policy. Once you start reading about fiat currency, fractional reserve banking, and quantitative easing, the economy begins feeling less concrete and more psychological. The weirdest realization was understanding that modern finance depends heavily on collective belief. Money works because people agree it works. At some point, I remember just sitting there thinking, the entire global economy is basically built on trust, debt, and confidence, held together by human belief. Story 2. The Sovereign Citizen Movement. At first, it just looked funny. You see clips online of people arguing with police during traffic stops, refusing licenses, saying bizarre legal phrases, claiming courts have no authority over them, stuff that seems ridiculous and harmless. Then you keep digging, and you realize a lot of these people genuinely believe the government is secretly illegitimate, that laws only apply if they consent, and that hidden loopholes in old legal documents can somehow free them from taxes, debts, criminal charges, or state authority entirely. That's where it stopped being entertaining for me. The movement basically operates inside its own alternate reality. Members trade pseudo-legal theories, fake constitutional interpretations, conspiracy claims, and homemade legal documents that sound convincing enough to pull vulnerable people in. And the scary part is how fast paranoia escalates. A lot of sovereign citizens become convinced judges, police, banks, and government workers are part of some giant fraudulent system stealing freedom from real citizens. Once somebody fully accepts that worldview, normal institutions stop meaning anything to them. That's why law enforcement agencies take the movement seriously. There have been shootings, armed standoffs, intimidation campaigns, fake liens against officials, and violent attacks connected to extremist believers. Most followers never become violent, but the ideology itself encourages people to view government authority as fundamentally illegitimate. The rabbit hole that really got me wasn't just the movement itself. It was realizing how easily misinformation, isolation, and online echo chambers can slowly build entire parallel realities where people become detached from basic shared facts altogether. Story 3. The Falklands War. At first, I thought it was just some short, obscure conflict over remote islands in the South Atlantic. Then I started reading firsthand accounts from soldiers, pilots, and sailors, and realized how unbelievably brutal and surreal the war actually was. The environment alone sounded horrific. Freezing rain, peat bogs, constant wind, almost no cover, soldiers carrying absurd amounts of gear across miles of rough terrain. That's where I first learned about the Yomp, the forced marches carried out by British Royal Marines and paratroopers after ships and helicopters were lost. The more I read, the crazier it got. You had low-flying jet attacks skimming ocean waves, ships burning in icy water, special forces raids, dogfights with missiles at visual range, and infantry battles fought in freezing darkness on rocky hills with fixed bayonets. And the war felt strangely transitional too. It had elements of old warfare and modern warfare colliding together. World War II-style naval losses happening alongside advanced missile systems and supersonic aircraft. A lot of military analysts still study it because it exposed how vulnerable modern ships could be, even against relatively small air attacks. Then I fell into interviews with veterans talking about the psychological side of it, the exhaustion, the cold, the isolation. Young guys suddenly finding themselves in real combat at the edge of the world. Honestly, that's what hooked me. The Falklands War feels weirdly forgotten compared to larger conflicts. But once you start digging into it, it becomes one of the most intense and fascinating military rabbit holes out there. Story 4. The Stargate Project rabbit hole completely pulled me in because it sits in this bizarre space between Cold War paranoia, intelligence operations, pseudoscience, and genuine government funding. At first I assumed it was just internet conspiracy nonsense. Then I found out the US government actually spent years and millions of dollars researching remote viewing, telepathy, psychic spying, and other phenomena that sound straight out of science fiction. That's the part that got me. The program reportedly began during the Cold War after concerns that the Soviet Union was investigating psychic phenomena for intelligence purposes. And because neither side wanted to risk being technologically surprised, American agencies started funding their own research into whether human consciousness could somehow gather information remotely. So suddenly you have scientists, military officers, intelligence personnel, and contractors sitting in rooms seriously testing whether people could psychically describe distant locations, hidden objects, or secret military sites. And some of the documents are absolutely surreal to read. There are CIA files discussing remote viewers attempting to perceive foreign facilities, hostage locations, or hidden technology entirely through mental visualization. Some sessions were laughably inaccurate. Others were weirdly specific enough to keep funding alive longer than you'd expect. That's where SAIC enters the rabbit hole too, because parts of the research and analysis later became tied to defense contractors and classified intelligence work. Do I think they discovered real psychic superpowers? Probably not, but the fact that serious institutions spent decades unable to completely dismiss it is what makes the whole thing fascinating. The deeper you dig, the more it feels like a strange collision between science, espionage, fear, and the human desire to believe consciousness might be capable of something far beyond normal understanding. Story 5. The Lord of the Rings rabbit hole completely consumed me because at some point you realize it's not just a fantasy story. It's basically an entire mythological universe built by one obsessive genius over the course of decades. At first, I thought it was just elves, battles, and adventure. Then you start digging into the lore, and suddenly you discover that J.R.R. Tolkien literally invented full languages with grammar, history, dialects, and writing systems before parts of the story even existed. That's when the rabbit hole opens. The deeper you go, the more insane the scale becomes. Entire civilizations have thousands of years of history. Kingdoms rise and collapse long before the main story even starts. Characters casually mention ancient wars and legendary figures that already have complete backstories hidden in other books. Then you get into the Silmarillion and realize Tolkien basically created his own creation myth. Pantheon, fallen angels, apocalyptic wars, and in ancient tragedies, that make the events of Lord of the Rings feel tiny by comparison. And honestly, that's what hooked me. Middle-earth feels old in a way almost no fictional world does. There's this constant feeling that you're only seeing the fading remnants of something much larger and more ancient. Ruins have histories. Songs reference forgotten kingdoms. Even random swords and names have entire lineages behind them. At some point, I stopped feeling like I was reading fiction and started feeling like I was studying mythology from a real lost civilization. That's when I realized Tolkien didn't just write a story. He built an entire world deep enough for people to disappear into for years. Story 6. The Family Tree of Cleopatra. The seventh Philopater is one of the most insane historical rabbit holes I've ever fallen into, because the deeper you go, the more it starts feeling less like royal history and more like a slow-motion genetic disaster mixed with a political thriller. At first, you just think of Cleopatra as the Egyptian queen. Then you realize she was actually part of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Macedonian Greek dynasty descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals. And these people were obsessed with keeping power inside the family. Brother married sister, uncle married niece, cousins married cousins, over and over for generations. Some family trees practically turn into circles. Historians still argue over who certain mothers even were because the same names repeat constantly and records become a mess. Then the palace politics get even crazier. Assassinations, poisonings, betrayals, civil wars, siblings trying to murder each other for the throne. Cleopatra herself had to politically outmaneuver multiple relatives just to survive. And despite all that chaos, she still became one of the most famous women in history. What really hooked me was realizing how culturally strange the dynasty actually was. They ruled ancient Egypt for centuries, but stayed heavily Greek culturally, speaking Greek in court while presenting themselves publicly as Egyptian pharaohs. It's this bizarre collision of Greek dynastic politics, Egyptian religion, Roman expansion, and family dysfunction all collapsing together at the very end of the ancient world. Story 7. The Disappearance of Malaysia Airlines Flight 37. Completely pulled me into one of the deepest rabbit holes I've ever gone down, because the more you learn about it, the less it feels possible that a modern commercial airliner could simply vanish. In 2014, the Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 disappeared while flying from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing with 239 people on board. At first, everyone assumed it was a normal crash somewhere nearby. Then the data started getting weird. The plane apparently deviated from its planned route, lost communication, crossed back over Malaysia, and continued flying for hours after it supposedly vanished. Military radar, satellite pings, automated systems, all of it painted this eerie picture of a massive aircraft silently flying into the darkness long after the world thought contact was lost. That's what hooked me. Investigators eventually concluded the plane likely flew deep into the southern Indian Ocean, one of the most remote places on Earth. But despite one of the largest search operations in aviation history, involving ships, sonar mapping, satellites, underwater drones, and multiple governments, the main wreckage has never been conclusively found. And the theories get insane fast. Pilot suicide, hijacking, depressurization, electrical fire, military involvement, cyber attack, accidental ghost flight. Every possibility has holes in it, which is why people keep obsessing over the case years later. The creepiest part for me is realizing how fragile modern tracking actually was. People assume every aircraft is constantly monitored perfectly, but MH370, exposed huge blind spots in global aviation systems. A giant passenger jet carrying hundreds of people somehow slipped into one of the largest empty spaces on Earth and may still be sitting there undiscovered at the bottom of the ocean. Story 8. The rabbit hole around children who supposedly remember past lives completely wrecked my skepticism for a while because I went into it assuming it would all be obvious nonsense. Then discovered there are actual documented cases that are way harder to dismiss than I expected. A lot of the research traces back to Ian Stevenson at the University of Virginia, who spent decades investigating thousands of cases involving young children claiming to remember previous lives. Normally, I'd instantly dismiss something like that, but what hooked me was how methodical some of the investigations were. In many cases, the children were extremely young, usually between ages 2 and 6, and would suddenly begin describing specific names, locations, occupations, deaths, or families they supposedly belonged to before they were born. Some reportedly recognized people or places they should never have known about. And then there are the birthmark cases. That part genuinely unsettled me. Stevenson documented cases where children had unusual birthmarks or deformities allegedly corresponding to fatal wounds suffered by the deceased person they claimed to have been. In some investigations, medical records and autopsy reports were compared afterward. Do I think this proves reincarnation? Honestly, I still don't know. There are possible explanations involving suggestion, coincidence, cultural reinforcement, selective reporting, information leakage, or flawed investigation methods. Critics absolutely exist, and some cases probably are exaggerated. But the rabbit hole becomes fascinating because even skeptical researchers admit a small percentage of cases are genuinely difficult to explain cleanly. And once you start reading dozens of them, you suddenly realize how fragile your assumptions about memory, identity, and consciousness actually are. Story 9. The rabbit hole around ancient flood myths completely pulled me in because at first, it sounds like a weird coincidence. Then you realize just how many civilizations separated by oceans and thousands of years all preserve stories about catastrophic floods destroying humanity. You start with the Epic of Gilgamesh and realize the flood story in it predates the biblical Noah narrative. Then you find flood myths in ancient Greek traditions, Hindu texts, Chinese legends, indigenous American stories, Norse mythology, Aboriginal Australian traditions, basically everywhere, and suddenly you start wondering, why does almost every civilization seem obsessed with floods? That's where the rabbit hole really starts. Some stories are incredibly similar too. Divine punishment, a chosen survivor, a boat or protected refuge, animals being saved, civilization restarting afterward. It becomes hard not to notice the overlap. Then you start reading about the end of the last ice age. Sea levels rose massively around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago as glaciers melted. Entire coastlines disappeared. Areas where humans once lived are now underwater. Some researchers think ancient people may have witnessed catastrophic regional flooding events so traumatic they became embedded into oral traditions for thousands of years. And honestly, that explanation feels more fascinating to me than the supernatural one, because oral storytelling is insanely powerful. If a civilization survived a massive flood that destroyed cities, farmland, or entire populations, the memory could easily transform into sacred mythology over generations. The really creepy realization is that most ancient humans lived near water because that's where survival was easiest, which means rising seas after the Ice Age may have erased enormous amounts of early human history that now sits permanently underwater. So these flood myths might not just be symbolic stories. They could be distorted cultural memories of real prehistoric disasters humanity never fully forgot. Story 10, The Philadelphia Experiment. Rabbit hole completely pulled me in because it starts sounding like obvious nonsense, then slowly mutates into this bizarre mix of military history, Cold War paranoia, UFO lore, physics misunderstandings, and possible psychological manipulation. The basic story is insane. Supposedly during World War II, the U.S. Navy conducted secret experiments aboard the USS Eldridge, attempting to make the ship invisible to radar, or in some versions, literally invisible altogether. According to the legend, something went horribly wrong. People claim the ship vanished in a greenish haze, teleported between ports, and that crew members suffered horrifying effects afterward. Some stories say sailors became mentally unstable. Others claimed men were fused into the ship's metal structure itself. That imagery alone is enough to suck people in. Then you start tracing where the story actually came from, and it gets even stranger. Much of the mythology appears tied to a man named Carl Meredith Allen, who sent bizarre letters to UFO researcher Morris Jessup in the 1950s describing secret naval experiments and Einstein-style unified field theories. The deeper you dig, the more tangled everything becomes. There are real historical elements mixed in, too. The Navy genuinely experimented with degaussing technology to reduce magnetic signatures against mines and detection systems. Wartime secrecy added fuel to rumors fast. Most historians think the teleportation and invisibility stories are fabricated or heavily distorted. But honestly, that's what makes the rabbit hole fascinating. It became this perfect cultural collision of wartime secrecy, emerging conspiracy culture, misunderstood science, and humanity's obsession with hidden government experiments that might have gone catastrophically wrong. Story 11, The Ice Wall Rabbit Hole, completely fascinated me because it's one of those conspiracy theories that starts sounding absurd, then somehow expands into this enormous alternate cosmology with maps, hidden history, secret governments, Antarctica lore, and people who genuinely believe the entire structure of Earth is being hidden from the public. Most versions of the theory connect back to flat Earth beliefs. The idea is that Antarctica is not actually a continent at the bottom of a globe, but instead a giant ring of ice surrounding the edges of the world. According to believers, governments supposedly guard this ice wall to prevent people from discovering what lies beyond it. And that's where the rabbit hole gets really weird. Some theories claim there are hidden continents beyond the wall. Others say advanced civilizations, military bases, entrances to inner Earth, or even entirely different worlds exist outside the known map. Then you get into old expedition stories, strange interpretations of Antarctic treaties, satellite image conspiracies, and claims that explorers discovered things too important to reveal publicly. The reason the rabbit hole hooked me wasn't because I believed it. It was because of how elaborate the mythology became. People build entire self-contained worldviews around it, complete with custom maps, reinterpretations of physics, fake historical timelines, and massive distrust of institutions. Every contradiction becomes evidence of a cover-up instead of disproof. And honestly, the psychology behind it became more interesting than the theory itself. The ice wall idea taps into something ancient in humans. The belief that beyond the edge of the known world, there's still something hidden, forbidden, or undiscovered, waiting out there beyond the map. Story 12, DMT, completely fascinated me because the reports from people who take it are weirdly consistent in ways that honestly shouldn't happen if it were all just random hallucinations. At first, I assumed it would be typical psychedelic stuff: colors, distorted perception, emotional experiences. Then I started reading trip reports, and over, people described encountering entities. Not vague feelings, but actual, seemingly intelligent beings interacting with them directly. Machine elves, geometric creatures, insectoid intelligences, godlike figures, impossible architectures, entire worlds that feel more real than ordinary reality. That's the part that hooked me. People from completely different cultures and backgrounds often report strangely similar themes despite having no connection to one another. Hyperdimensional spaces, communication without language, the overwhelming feeling that something conscious is on the other side of the experience waiting for them. And the experiences can feel more real than waking life. That detail comes up constantly. Neurologically, researchers think DMT massively disrupts normal sensory filtering and network activity in the brain, especially systems involved in self-perception and reality construction. Some theories suggest the brain under psychedelics generates agency and meaning out of chaos extremely aggressively. But honestly, even many skeptical people admit the consistency of the entity encounters is difficult to ignore completely. Then you fall deeper into the rabbit hole and discover theories connecting DMT to near-death experiences, ancient shamanic rituals, consciousness research, and speculation that the brain may function more like a receiver than a generator of awareness. Do I think people are literally visiting another dimension? I genuinely don't know. But the rabbit hole becomes fascinating because DMT experiences force you to confront how little we actually understand about consciousness, perception, and the brain's ability to construct reality itself. Story 13. At first, the idea that reality could be a simulation sounded like pure sci-fi nonsense to me. Then I came across Nick Bostrom's argument, and it completely changed how I thought about the concept. The logic is weirdly simple. If humanity eventually becomes advanced enough to create ultra-realistic simulations filled with conscious beings, and if civilizations end up running millions or billions of those simulations, then statistically there would be far more simulated realities than real ones, which means the odds of us existing in the original base reality might actually be incredibly small. That idea genuinely messed with my head. Then you start realizing how many scientists, physicists, philosophers, and tech people have at least entertained the possibility seriously. Not necessarily believing it outright, but admitting there's no clean way to fully disprove it either. And once you go deeper, the rabbit hole becomes endless. People start connecting the theory to quantum mechanics, mathematical structures in physics, the speed of light acting like a processing cap, or the strange behavior of particles when they're observed. Most of it is speculative, but it becomes weirdly addictive to think about. The creepiest realization for me wasn't even the possibility of living in a simulation. It was realizing how limited human perception already is. Everything we experience is filtered through the brain using electrical signals and sensory interpretation. Humans never directly experience objective reality anyway, only the brain's constructed version of it. At some point, the whole discussion stops being about computers and starts becoming this huge philosophical question about consciousness, existence, and whether humans are even capable of understanding reality beyond what our minds allow us to perceive. Story 14. The Phoebus Cartel was a real alliance formed in the 1920s between major light bulb manufacturers, including companies tied to General Electric, Osram, and Philips. And one of their goals was genuinely insane. They intentionally reduced how long light bulbs lasted. At the time, manufacturers were competing to create more durable bulbs that could burn for thousands of hours. But the cartel realized longer-lasting products were actually bad for business because customers wouldn't need replacements as often. So they standardized bulb lifespans to around 1,000 hours. Companies whose bulbs exceeded that lifespan could actually be fined by the cartel. That's what pulled me into the rabbit hole. The deeper you dig, the more it starts feeling like the origin point of modern planned obsolescence. The idea that products should not be designed to last forever, even if they technically could. Then you discover things like the Centennial Light, a bulb that has reportedly been glowing for over 100 years in a California fire station. And suddenly, the whole thing becomes even creepier. Obviously, modern products involve trade-offs between efficiency, brightness, heat, and cost. But the cartel proved something people still argue about today. Manufacturers sometimes intentionally limit durability because endless replacement is more profitable than permanence. After reading about it, I started noticing similar accusations everywhere. Smartphones with sealed batteries, printers rejecting third-party ink, appliances that fail after a few years, software slowing older devices. Whether intentional or not, the light bulb syndicate became this weird symbolic starting point for the idea that modern consumer culture may quietly depend on products never lasting too long. Story 15. Li Hongji is one of those figures where the deeper you dig, the more unexpectedly massive the web around him becomes. At first, it just looks like another spiritual movement. Then you realize he founded Falun Gong during the 1990s in China, combining meditation practices, qigong exercises, and spiritual teachings. But after the Chinese government cracked down on the movement in 1999, everything escalated dramatically. That's where the rabbit hole opens. Falun Gong evolved far beyond just a meditation group. Over time, it built an enormous international network involving media companies, cultural organizations, activist groups, YouTube channels, newspapers, dance companies, and anti-Chinese Communist Party activism spread across multiple countries. Then you discover the Epoch Times, and suddenly the scale becomes much bigger than most people realize. The Epoch Times started as a small anti-CCP newspaper, but eventually grew into a massive global media operation, heavily active online, especially during political events, conspiracy discussions, and culture war topics. Then there's Shen Yun, which markets itself as a traditional Chinese dance performance, while also containing messaging tied to Falun Gong beliefs and persecution narratives. And the beliefs themselves get increasingly strange the deeper you go. Aliens corrupting humanity, spiritual purification, apocalyptic themes, supernatural abilities through cultivation, anti-modernity ideas, all mixed together with genuine accounts of persecution by the Chinese state. That's what makes the rabbit hole so complicated, because there are simultaneously real human rights issues, legitimate political repression, intense propaganda battles, media influence campaigns, spiritual teachings, and conspiracy-like belief systems, all tangled together in one giant global network. Story 16. The rabbit hole around nuclear energy and radiation completely changed how I thought about the topic, because most people grow up associating anything nuclear with apocalyptic danger. Then you start reading the actual engineering and accident reports and realize reality is way more complicated. Take the Chernobyl disaster. People know it as one of the worst nuclear disasters ever, but the deeper you dig into why it happened, the more bizarre the reactor design becomes. The RBMK reactors used in the Soviet Union had a dangerous flaw called a positive void coefficient, where under certain conditions, the reactor could actually become more reactive as steam formed. That's the insane part. During the test that night, operators hit the AZ-5 emergency shutdown button, expecting the reactor to stop. Instead, because of flaws in the control rod design, the initial insertion briefly increased reactivity and caused a catastrophic power surge before shutdown could occur. An emergency stop button literally helped trigger the explosion. And once you compare nuclear deaths statistically to coal, oil, air pollution, mining accidents, and fossil fuel emissions, the numbers start looking shocking. Even with disasters like Chernobyl and Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster, nuclear energy has caused dramatically fewer deaths per unit of energy than many conventional sources. Then you start learning about radiation itself. Low-dose exposure, background radiation, banana radiation jokes, radiation hormesis debates, radioactive medicine, cosmic rays. Suddenly, the topic becomes way less black and white than people imagine. What really hooked me was realizing nuclear energy may be one of the few technologies feared more because its dangers are visible and dramatic, while far deadlier forms of pollution quietly kill people constantly without headlines. Story 17. The audiophile rabbit hole gets genuinely surreal once you spend enough time around it, because it slowly turns from people who like good sound systems into something that starts resembling a religious movement mixed with luxury fashion and pseudoscience. At first, it seems reasonable. Better speakers sound better. Higher quality headphones matter. Room acoustics affect music. Sure. Then you keep digging, and suddenly people are spending thousands of dollars on gold-plated Ethernet cables, wooden volume knobs, vibration isolation platforms, directional audio cables, or little metal risers that supposedly lift speaker wires off the floor to improve sound quality. That's when it starts feeling like healing crystals for middle-aged men with disposable income. The craziest part is how heated the debates get. You'll see people arguing for hundreds of comments over whether a $4,000 cable creates warmer mids or more spacious imaging, while engineers are sitting there pointing at blind tests showing listeners usually can't tell the difference consistently. And honestly, the psychology behind it becomes fascinating. Once somebody spends enormous amounts of money on equipment, expectation bias kicks in hard. People genuinely hear improvements because the brain is incredibly suggestible, especially with sensory experiences like audio. But mixed into all the nonsense is real science too. Good speakers absolutely matter. Compression affects sound. DACs, mastering quality, room treatment, and headphones can genuinely transform music. That's why the rabbit hole becomes so addictive, because there's enough truth mixed with subjective perception that the line between engineering and superstition starts getting blurry. The funniest realization for me was that a lot of audiophile culture isn't really about perfect sound. It's about chasing perfection endlessly, convincing yourself the next tiny upgrade will finally unlock the true experience of music. Story 18. The Great Pyramid of Giza is one of the deepest rabbit holes on Earth, because the more you learn about it, the less it feels like a simple tomb, and the more it starts feeling like humanity left behind some gigantic engineering obsession in the middle of the desert. At first you just think, big triangle, ancient tomb. Then you realize the Great Pyramid was the tallest human-made structure on Earth for nearly 4,000 years. That alone is ridiculous. Then you start reading about the precision involved. Multi-ton stone blocks aligned astonishingly close to true north, massive internal chambers, astronomical alignments, construction accuracy that seems impossible for what most people imagine ancient technology looked like. And that's where the rabbit hole splits in two. One side is real archaeology and engineering, which is already fascinating enough. Quarry systems, labor organization, ramps, copper tools, logistics, mathematics, ancient surveying methods. The deeper historians dig, the more impressive the builders become. The other side becomes total chaos. Lost civilizations, Atlantis theories, Aliens, hidden chambers, secret energy generators, sacred geometry, apocalypse predictions. People basically turned the pyramids into giant stone magnets for every mystery imaginable. What hooked me wasn't the alien theories, though. It was realizing how psychologically powerful the pyramids are. They feel wrong somehow, too old, too massive, too precise to fit comfortably into most people's mental image of the ancient world. And the creepiest realization is that the pyramids were already ancient to people living in ancient Egypt itself. Entire empires rose and collapsed while those structures just sat there, watching thousands of years of history happen around them. Story 19. Aliens get really unsettling once you start realizing how enormous the universe actually is. There are billions of stars in the Milky Way alone, and likely trillions of galaxies beyond it. Statistically, it feels almost impossible that intelligent life evolved only once. Then you run into the Fermi paradox. If intelligent civilizations should be everywhere, why do we see absolutely nothing definitive? That question completely changes the conversation. Maybe advanced civilizations destroy themselves before reaching interstellar travel. Maybe intelligent life is incredibly rare. Maybe the distances between stars are too extreme, even for advanced species. Or maybe humanity is being deliberately ignored. Then you get into UFO history, and things become even stranger. Military pilots reporting impossible maneuvers, radar anomalies, declassified footage, Cold War disinformation campaigns, secret aerospace projects getting mixed together with genuine unexplained sightings. And honestly, that's what makes the topic so addictive. There's enough real mystery mixed with nonsense that it becomes impossible to fully separate fact from mythology. The psychological side gets weird too. Humans constantly reinterpret the unknown through cultural lenses. In ancient times, people described angels, demons, or sky beings. During the atomic age, it shifted toward extraterrestrials and advanced spacecraft. What really stuck with me is how little humans actually know about reality beyond Earth. We've barely explored our own oceans, barely left our own planet, and still argue over consciousness itself. Yet people confidently assume we understand whether intelligent life exists elsewhere in a universe so massive the human brain can barely process its scale. Story 20, the Universe 25. Experiments get deeply unsettling once you start reading the details, because they stop feeling like simple rat studies and start sounding weirdly symbolic of modern society. In the 1960s and 70s, researcher John B. Calhoun created controlled utopias for rats and mice. The animals had unlimited food, water, shelter, and no predators. In theory, it should have been paradise. At first, population growth exploded. Then things started going wrong. As overcrowding increased, the social structure of the colonies began collapsing in bizarre ways. Mothers abandoned offspring. Violence increased. Some animals became hyper-aggressive, while others completely withdrew from social interaction. And then there were the beautiful ones. These were rats that stopped mating, stopped fighting, and stopped participating in normal social behavior altogether. They spent almost all their time grooming themselves, eating, and existing in isolation, while population collapse accelerated around them. Eventually, the colonies died out entirely, despite having abundant resources. That's the part that really disturbed people. The experiments became famous because many observers saw eerie parallels to human urbanization, alienation, declining birth rates, social withdrawal, rising isolation, and the psychological effects of overcrowded modern life. Now, obviously, humans are not rats, and plenty of scientists criticize people for over-applying Calhoun's conclusions directly to society. But the imagery is hard to shake. A species given material abundance slowly loses social cohesion, purpose, reproduction, and stable behavior until collapse emerges from psychological and social dysfunction rather than starvation or predators. Whether or not the comparison is scientifically fair, the experiments became one of those haunting metaphors people can't stop revisiting whenever modern society starts feeling strangely disconnected or directionless. Story 21, holography gets insanely fascinating once you realize holograms are not just fancy 3D pictures, they're literally recordings of light itself. That's the part that blew my mind. Normal photography captures the intensity of light. Holography captures both intensity and the phase of light waves using interference patterns, usually with lasers, which means a hologram preserves actual three-dimensional information about an object rather than just a flat image. And the weirdest part is what happens when you cut one apart. With a normal photograph, cutting the picture in half destroys half the image. But with a hologram, even tiny fragments can still reproduce the entire image, just from different angles and with less detail. That feels almost impossible the first time you learn it. Then you start discovering what holography can actually do beyond novelty art. Anti-counterfeit security features on money and credit cards, scientific imaging, data storage experiments, microscopy, interferometry capable of detecting microscopic vibrations and deformations. And then the rabbit hole gets philosophical. Some physicists started using holography as a model for understanding the universe itself, leading to ideas like the holographic principle, where information describing a volume of space might actually be encoded on a lower dimensional boundary, which basically sounds like reality itself might function somewhat like a hologram. Most people only think of holograms as sci-fi projections floating in the air, but the actual science behind them is way stranger and more beautiful. It's one of those technologies where the deeper you go, the more it starts feeling less like visual trickery and more like humans discovering bizarre hidden properties of light and information itself. Story 22. The simulation hypothesis gets really disturbing once you realize it's not just internet sci-fi nonsense anymore, and that actual philosophers and scientists have seriously debated it. The idea became famous largely because of Nick Bostrom and his argument that if civilizations become advanced enough to create ultra-realistic simulations containing conscious beings, then simulated realities could vastly outnumber real ones, which leads to the uncomfortable conclusion that statistically we might be more likely to exist inside a simulation than in the original base reality. And honestly, once that idea gets into your head, it's hard to stop thinking about. Then people start connecting it to physics. Quantum mechanics behaves strangely when observed. The speed of light acts like some kind of processing limit, mathematical structures appearing everywhere in nature. The fact that reality, at its deepest levels, seems weirdly informational and probabilistic rather than solid and intuitive. Most of those connections are speculative, but they make the theory incredibly addictive to think about. The creepiest part for me is not even whether the simulation idea is true. It's realizing humans already never experience objective reality directly anyway. Everything you see, hear, and feel is processed by the brain through electrical signals. Consciousness already constructs a kind of internal simulation of the outside world. So suddenly, the line between real and simulated becomes philosophically slippery. At some point, the rabbit hole stops being about computers and starts becoming this much bigger question about consciousness itself. Whether reality is fundamentally physical, informational, mathematical, or something humans simply do not have the cognitive ability to fully understand. Story 23. Space and the ocean both become terrifying once you realize humans have barely explored either of them in any meaningful way. People talk about space as the final frontier, but the ocean is arguably creepier because it's right here on Earth and still almost completely unknown. More than 80% of the ocean remains unmapped and unexplored in detail. Humans have better maps of parts of Mars than sections of our own seafloor. That realization alone is insane. Then you start learning about what's actually down there. Deep sea gigantism, transparent animals, creatures produce their own light through bioluminescence, squid larger than buses, fish surviving under pressures that would instantly crush a human body, entire ecosystems existing around hydrothermal vents with no sunlight whatsoever. And the ocean gets darker psychologically the deeper you go. Below certain depths, there's permanent darkness forever. No sunlight has reached some regions for millions of years. Creatures evolve in conditions so alien they genuinely look extraterrestrial. Then you switch to space, and somehow it becomes even more overwhelming. Black holes warping space-time itself. Neutron stars so dense a spoonful would weigh billions of tons. The observable universe contains potentially trillions of galaxies. Light from distant stars takes millions or billions of years to even reach Earth, and the scale completely destroys your brain after a while. The most unsettling part for me is realizing humanity exists in this tiny, fragile bubble between two enormous unknowns, the abyss below us and the abyss above us. We barely understand consciousness, barely understand our own oceans, and have physically explored only a microscopic fraction of the cosmos. Yet people still walk around, acting like humanity has reality mostly figured out. Story 24, Lake Vostok is one of the creepiest places on Earth once you realize what it actually is. An enormous lake buried beneath miles of Antarctic ice, completely sealed off from the outside world for an estimated 15 to 25 million years. That timeline is what completely hooked me. Human beings didn't even exist yet when this lake was isolated. Entire species evolved and went extinct while this dark hidden body of water remained trapped beneath the ice, untouched. And somehow there may still be life down there. That's the insane part. Scientists think geothermal heat and immense pressure keep the water liquid despite the brutal Antarctic temperatures above. If microorganisms or ecosystems survived inside the lake, they would have evolved in total darkness under crushing pressure and complete isolation for millions of years, potentially an entirely separate evolutionary pathway hidden beneath the ice. Then you realize why astrobiologists are obsessed with it. Places like Lake Vostok are considered possible analogs for alien environments on icy moons like Europa or Enceladus, where giant oceans may exist beneath frozen crusts. Studying life in these isolated Antarctic lakes could literally help scientists understand how extraterrestrial life might survive elsewhere in the solar system. And honestly, the psychological aspect is what gets me most. There's something deeply unsettling about the idea that beneath miles of ice on our own planet, hidden ecosystems may exist that have remained completely cut off from the rest of Earth since before humans even evolved. It makes Antarctica stop feeling like just frozen wilderness and start feeling more like another planet accidentally attached to ours. Story 25, Banned TV Episodes. Get weirdly fascinating because the deeper you dig, the more you realize entire chunks of pop culture basically vanish over time, depending on politics, scandals, censorship, lawsuits, or changing social standards. Sometimes it's obvious stuff. Episodes pulled for extreme violence, offensive stereotypes, controversial jokes, or references networks no longer want associated with a show. But then you start finding cases where episodes disappear so completely that people argue online for years over whether they even existed. That's where it gets interesting. A lot of older cartoons, especially, became strange time capsules. Episodes banned for racial caricatures, wartime propaganda, suicide references, mass panic fears, or themes considered too disturbing for children. Some were aired once and then quietly buried forever. Then there are the legendary cases. The banned Pokemon episode that allegedly caused seizures in hundreds of children in Japan because of rapidly flashing lights. The infamous missing episodes people swear traumatized them as kids. Lost broadcasts destroyed or taped over by networks because nobody thought preserving them mattered at the time. And honestly, the internet made the rabbit hole way bigger. Once something gets banned, people immediately mythologize it. Rumors grow, fake screenshots appear. Lost media communities start hunting through archives, trying to recover recordings from decades ago. Some episodes become almost creepier because they're unavailable. The idea that pieces of mass media watched by millions can simply disappear, get locked away, or survive only through bootlegs and fragmented memories feels strangely unsettling in the digital age where people assume everything lasts forever online. And sometimes when banned episodes finally resurface, they're not even shocking anymore. But the mystery surrounding them became more powerful than the actual content itself. Story 26, where government money actually goes, becomes a surprisingly dark rabbit hole once you start realizing how massive modern state budgets really are, and how difficult it is for ordinary people to track where huge portions of that money end up. At first, you assume it's straightforward. Taxes come in, governments fund roads, schools, healthcare, military, infrastructure, public services. Then you start reading budget reports and procurement systems, and suddenly you discover layers upon layers of contractors, subcontractors, consulting firms, defense deals, administrative agencies, lobbying groups, grant programs, and bureaucratic structures moving around amounts of money so large the human brain almost stops processing them realistically. That's the unsettling part. $1 billion already sounds abstract. Governments deal in trillions. Then you get into military spending, and things become even crazier. Massive weapons contracts, cost overruns, projects that continue for decades, equipment costing absurd amounts because of procurement systems and political incentives. And it's not always outright corruption either. A lot of the time, it's inefficiency, bureaucracy, lobbying pressure, political compromise, emergency spending, overlapping agencies, or systems becoming so large nobody fully understands them anymore. But there are real corruption cases too. Kickbacks, insider contracts, revolving doors between government and corporations, lobbying influence, hidden offshore money, missing funds that are actually buried inside accounting chaos rather than literally disappearing. What really hooked me was realizing modern governments are so financially enormous that even tiny percentages of waste or corruption translate into mind-boggling amounts of money. And once you start reading audits, inspector general reports, and procurement investigations, you realize how difficult genuine transparency becomes when entire systems operate at scales ordinary citizens can barely conceptualize. Story 27, the role of the Catholic Church during the colonization of the Americas becomes an unbelievably dark rabbit hole once you start reading the actual documents from the time, instead of the simplified versions taught in school. The Spanish requirement of 1513 is one of the most surreal examples. Spanish conquistadors were instructed to read this declaration to indigenous peoples before invading their lands. The document basically informed them that God had granted authority over the earth to the Pope. The Pope had granted these lands to the Spanish crown, and the indigenous population now had to accept Christianity and Spanish rule. If they refused, the Spanish claimed they were justified in enslaving them, taking their property, waging war against them, and causing whatever deaths followed. And the most insane part? The requirement was often read in Spanish to people who had absolutely no idea what was being said. Sometimes it was reportedly read to empty beaches or forests, simply so the conquistadors could technically claim they had fulfilled the legal requirement before attacking. That detail completely broke my brain. Then you start digging deeper into the relationship between religion, empire, forced conversion, missionary systems, land seizure, and colonial power structures across the New World. And it becomes incredibly complicated because the church wasn't a monolith either. Some clergy justified conquest and conversion. Others, like Bartolomé de las Casas, became fierce critics of Spanish brutality against indigenous peoples. But overall, the church was deeply intertwined with colonial expansion and legitimizing imperial authority. The deeper you go, the more you realize colonization wasn't just military conquest. It was also ideological conquest, reshaping entire civilizations spiritually, culturally, linguistically, and politically under the belief that it was morally justified. Story 28. The Dyatlov Pass incident is one of those mysteries that gets stranger the more you read because almost every detail sounds slightly wrong. In 1959, 9 experienced hikers died in the northern Ural Mountains under bizarre circumstances during a skiing expedition led by Igor Dyatlov. When rescuers found the campsite, the tent had been cut open from the inside. That detail immediately hooked people. It looked like the group had fled into freezing darkness and extreme panic, many without proper clothing or boots despite brutal sub-zero temperatures. Some bodies were found barefoot in the snow miles away from camp. Then the injuries made the case even creepier. Several hikers died from hypothermia, but others had massive internal trauma, fractured ribs, crushed skulls, and injuries compared by investigators to car crash impacts. Yet, with little external damage, one victim was missing her tongue, another was missing eyes. Then came rumors about radiation traces on clothing, strange orange lights in the sky, military testing, avalanches, secret weapons, infrasound-induced panic, escaped prisoners, even Yeti theories. And honestly, the environment itself makes the story feel cursed. Pitch-black mountains, violent winds, Soviet secrecy, frozen bodies scattered across the wilderness, incomplete reports, missing documents, contradictory evidence. For decades, the Soviet investigation basically concluded the hikers died because of an unknown compelling force, which only fueled the mystery further. Modern researchers mostly lean toward natural explanations now, particularly avalanche-related theories combined with hypothermia and disorientation. But the reason the case refuses to die online is because the scene itself feels so deeply uncanny. Everything about it creates the overwhelming impression that something terrifying happened on that mountain and nobody fully understood it afterward. Story 29. Electric eel sound, like fantasy creatures somebody accidentally placed into real life. The fact that an animal evolved the ability to generate electricity strong enough to stun prey, defend itself, and even affect humans is already insane. Large electric eels can produce shocks of hundreds of volts, enough to knock people unconscious in water under the wrong conditions. And the deeper you go, the weirder they become. They don't just randomly emit electricity. They actively use electric fields, almost like a sensory system. In murky rivers, where visibility is terrible, electric eels can navigate, hunt, and detect nearby animals by sensing disturbances in the electrical field around them, which basically means they perceive the world in a way humans can barely imagine. Then you discover they can remotely force prey to move. That part genuinely blew my mind. Researchers found electric eels can fire rapid electrical pulses that directly activate the nerves and muscles of nearby fish, essentially causing involuntary muscle contractions. The prey literally reveals itself by twitching against its own will. It's like a biological remote control, and somehow it gets stranger. Electric eels aren't technically true eels at all. They're actually more closely related to knife fish. Most of their body is basically a giant biological battery made of specialized electrocyte cells stacked together like living capacitors. What hooked me most was realizing evolution somehow stumbled into electrical engineering millions of years before humans existed. Nature independently invented a creature capable of generating, controlling, and weaponizing electricity in dark river systems long before humanity even understood what electricity was. Story 30. The Bell Island hum became this massive local mystery around Bell Island because people genuinely started reporting a strange low-frequency humming noise that seemed to come from nowhere. And the weirdest part is how inconsistent it was. Some residents described hearing or even feeling vibrations late at night, like a deep industrial rumble coming through the ground or walls. Others said it sounded mechanical, almost like distant engines or heavy machinery operating underground. But not everyone could hear it. That's what always makes these hum cases so creepy. You see the same pattern worldwide. A small percentage of people become obsessed with a persistent low-frequency noise, while others nearby hear absolutely nothing at all. And once you start reading about it, you realize Bell Island is just one example in a whole category of unexplained hum phenomena reported across the world. Then the theories start. Secret military activity, old mining tunnels, geological movement, underwater acoustics, electrical infrastructure, wind turbines, psychological suggestion, industrial resonance. Some people even dragged UFOs into it because of course they did. And Bell Island already has this eerie atmosphere historically. Old iron ore mines running deep underground, abandoned tunnels, harsh Atlantic weather, isolation, wartime submarine attacks during World War II. The setting itself almost feels designed to generate ghost stories and local legends. What hooked me most is that low-frequency sound can genuinely mess with people psychologically. Certain frequencies can create feelings of anxiety, dread, pressure, headaches, vibration, even the sensation that something unseen is nearby. So even if there's a completely normal explanation buried somewhere underneath it all, the experience itself can still feel deeply uncanny to the people hearing it. Story 31. The idea of mole people living beneath major cities gets weirdly fascinating because it sits in this blurry space between urban legend, real homelessness, abandoned infrastructure, and mythology about hidden worlds beneath civilization. A lot of the modern stories trace back to places like New York City, where people discovered that homeless communities were actually living inside tunnels, abandoned subway lines, storm drains, and maintenance spaces beneath the city. And some of those underground networks are enormous. That's the part that hooked me. Most people have no idea how much infrastructure exists underneath major cities. utility tunnels, forgotten subway platforms, old sewer systems, maintenance corridors, abandoned stations, Cold War bunkers, underground rivers. Entire hidden layers of urban space most residents never see. Then the mythology starts growing around it. Stories about hidden societies underground. Entire communities surviving beneath the streets for decades. People disappearing into tunnel systems and never returning. Explorers find strange camps miles beneath cities. And honestly, some of the real stories are already unsettling enough without conspiracy theories. Photographers and journalists who documented tunnel communities in New York described people building makeshift homes beside subway tracks, deep underground, where daylight barely existed. Some residents lived there for years, hidden beneath one of the busiest cities on Earth. Then you go deeper into urban exploration culture and discover how many abandoned spaces cities quietly contain. Entire stations were sealed off for decades. Flooded tunnels, forgotten infrastructure maps, restricted maintenance zones most people never even realize exist beneath their feet. The creepiest realization for me was understanding that modern cities aren't just horizontal. They're vertical labyrinths with hidden layers below them, and most people walk above those spaces every day without ever thinking about what might actually be down there. Story 32. The ghost towns of the American frontier get strangely haunting once you realize how many entire communities appeared almost overnight, exploded with life, then completely died and were left to rot in the desert. A lot of them were mining towns. Gold, silver, copper, oil, whatever resource got discovered would trigger a frenzy. Thousands of people would flood into the middle of nowhere chasing wealth. Saloons, hotels, brothels, newspapers, banks, railroads, entire towns would materialize insanely fast. Then the resource dried up, and suddenly everyone vanished. That's the eerie part. Some places were abandoned so quickly that buildings, furniture, tools, signs, and personal belongings were just left behind. You can still walk through certain ghost towns today and see empty schools, churches, storefronts, and collapsing houses slowly being swallowed by the landscape. And the American West already has this mythic atmosphere around it. Deserts, mountains, isolation, outlaw history, boom and bust economies, harsh weather. Ghost towns almost feel like physical reminders of how temporary human ambition can be. Then you start reading the darker history tied to some of them. Mining disasters, shootouts, disease outbreaks, harsh labor conditions, environmental collapse, entire communities built on speculation and desperation. What hooked me most was realizing many ghost towns were once incredibly optimistic places. People genuinely believed they were building the future out there in the wilderness. Now, some of them are just empty streets creaking in the wind. The creepiest feeling is seeing how nature slowly reclaims everything. Buildings collapse, sand moves in, wood rots, signs fade away, and eventually entire towns almost disappear like they were never there at all. Story 33, analog horror on YouTube, gets ridiculously deep once you realize a lot of the best series aren't really trying to scare you with jump scares. They're trying to create this slow feeling that reality itself is slightly wrong. That's what makes the genre so addictive. Most analog horror uses fake VHS recordings, emergency broadcasts, public access TV, old training tapes, distorted cartoons, or corrupted educational videos to build atmosphere. The low-quality visuals actually make it creepier because your brain fills in gaps the video never fully explains. Then you start getting into the lore-heavy series. Hidden entities replacing people. Governments covering up impossible phenomena. Cosmic horror buried inside children's programming. entire alternate histories hidden across dozens of tiny clues and background details. And some creators go unbelievably hard with world building. Wendigoon became huge partly because he's good at unpacking these giant layered stories piece by piece. Some analog horror universes get so complicated, they basically turn into collaborative internet mythology. Then there are series like The Mandela Catalog, Local 58, or Gemini Home Entertainment, where the horror comes from implication more than direct explanation. That's the part that hooked me. The best analog horror feels like you accidentally found evidence of something hidden rather than watching a normal fictional story. The tapes look damaged, incomplete, forbidden, almost like they weren't meant to be discovered. And honestly, the fake analog aesthetic taps into something psychological too. Old VHS footage already feels ghostly and nostalgic. So when creators corrupt that familiar media style with cosmic horror or paranoia, it creates this weird, uncanny feeling that's hard to shake afterward. Story 34, The Mandela Effect, gets genuinely unsettling because it forces you to realize how unreliable human memory actually is, even when huge groups of people are completely convinced they remember something correctly. The name comes from the fact that thousands of people swore Nelson Mandela died in prison during the 1980s, complete with vivid memories of news coverage and funerals, even though he actually lived until 2013. And once you start looking into examples, it gets weird fast. People remembering Berenstain Bears instead of the Berenstain Bears. Pikachu supposedly has a black-tipped tail. Monopoly Man having a monocle. Famous movie quotes people remember incorrectly word for word. And the creepy part is how confident people are about these memories. That's what hooked me. Memory feels permanent and trustworthy, but neuroscience shows it's incredibly reconstructive. Every time humans remember something, the brain partially rebuilds the memory instead of replaying it perfectly like a recording, which means memories can slowly mutate over time without people noticing. But the internet made the Mandela effect explode because people suddenly discovered thousands of strangers sharing the exact same false memories. That collective aspect makes it feel way stranger psychologically. Then the theories get wild. Parallel universes, timeline shifts, reality glitches, CERN experiments altering history. Most scientists explain it through memory errors, suggestion, cultural overlap, and pattern recognition. But honestly, even knowing the rational explanation doesn't fully remove the eerie feeling, because the Mandela effect forces you to confront a really uncomfortable possibility. Your brain can confidently create memories that feel absolutely real, even when they never actually happened. Story 35. Bohemian Club and Bohemian Grove become an insanely fascinating rabbit hole because it's one of those places where real elite gatherings, secrecy, weird rituals, and conspiracy theories all collide together. At the surface level, it's basically a private retreat for wealthy and powerful men. Politicians, CEOs, military figures, media executives, academics, and business leaders have attended over the years. Every summer, they gather in this massive wooded campground in California for networking, drinking, performances, speeches, and private events. That alone already sounds suspicious to a lot of people. Then you learn about the rituals. The most famous is the cremation of care, where members gather before a giant owl statue for this theatrical ceremony involving robes, fire, chanting, and symbolic destruction of worldly worries. And obviously, once the internet discovered that, the theories exploded. Secret ruling class meetings, occult rituals, global conspiracies, shadow governments controlling world events in the woods. The fact that so many influential people attended over decades made the speculation almost inevitable. And honestly, the atmosphere itself fuels it perfectly. Old-growth forests, restricted access, political elites drinking together in private, strange symbolic ceremonies, heavy secrecy. It feels exactly like the setting people imagine when they think about hidden power structures. Most evidence suggests it's primarily an elite networking retreat mixed with theatrical traditions and fraternity-style rituals, rather than some literal, satanic command center. But what hooked me was the psychological side of it. The idea that many of the world's most influential people gather privately away from public scrutiny naturally makes people wonder how much real power actually operates informally behind closed doors, instead of through official systems everyone can see. Story 36. Near-death experiences become deeply unsettling once you realize how strangely consistent many reports are across different cultures, ages, and backgrounds. People clinically close to death often describe eerily similar experiences: leaving their bodies, watching doctors work on them from above, moving through darkness or tunnels toward light, feeling overwhelming peace, encountering dead relatives, spiritual beings, or places that feel more real than ordinary life. And what really hooks people is how transformative the experiences can be. A lot of people come back completely changed. Fear of death disappears. Priorities shift radically. Some become convinced consciousness exists independently of the brain. Then you get into the neurological explanations. Oxygen deprivation, temporal lobe activity, neurotransmitter floods, DMT release theories, dissociation, dying brain states. Scientists can explain pieces of the phenomenon, but no single explanation fully accounts for every reported detail. That uncertainty is what keeps the rabbit hole alive. Then you run into Emanuel Swedenborg, and things become even stranger. Swedenborg was an 18th century scientist and theologian who claimed to experience detailed visions of the afterlife while fully conscious. According to him, death was not an immediate judgment or abstract void, but more like waking up into another layer of reality. He described spirits gradually realizing they had died, entering environments shaped by their inner nature, and naturally gravitating toward communities reflecting who they truly were, psychologically and spiritually. And honestly, what's eerie is how some of his descriptions overlap with modern NDE reports despite being written centuries earlier. The feeling of heightened reality, encounters with deceased people, a transition rather than annihilation. The idea that consciousness continues in a form strangely similar to earthly existence, whether it's spirituality, brain chemistry, or something humans still don't understand. NDE has become one of those subjects where science, philosophy, and the fear of death all collide in a way that's incredibly hard to stop thinking about afterward. Story 37. Thalidomide is one of the darkest pharmaceutical rabbit holes ever because it completely changed how modern medicine handles drug testing and safety forever. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, thalidomide was marketed as a safe sedative and treatment for morning sickness in pregnant women. It was sold across multiple countries and advertised as extremely harmless, so safe that overdosing seemed almost impossible. Then babies started being born with catastrophic birth defects. Thousands of children were born with missing or severely shortened limbs, malformed organs, blindness, deafness, and other developmental abnormalities. Some infants died shortly after birth. Others survived with lifelong disabilities caused by the drug interfering with fetal development during pregnancy. And the horrifying part is how subtle the timing was. A pregnant woman could take thalidomide during a very small developmental window, sometimes just days, and the effects on the fetus could be devastating. What really pulled me into the rabbit hole was how close the disaster came to becoming even worse. In the United States, FDA reviewer Frances Oldham Kelsey repeatedly refused approval because she wasn't convinced the safety data was adequate. That decision likely prevented thousands more birth defects. And then the story gets even stranger because thalidomide eventually returned to medicine decades later. Researchers discovered it could actually help treat conditions like certain cancers and immune disorders under extremely strict controls. So, the same drug that caused one of history's most infamous medical disasters is still used medically today. The whole thing becomes this haunting reminder that pharmaceuticals powerful enough to heal can also become catastrophic when science moves faster than understanding. Story 38.